speaker, Hong Yu Wong, from Tübingen. His main interests are relation between perception and action and the role of the body in this relation. And today this event is organized around his book, which will be published by Oxford University Press. And the title of the book, Embodied Agency. And the first session will be on bodily awareness in action and the body schema. And then there will be a response by Eylem Özaltın from Koç University.
Thank you. Well, let me begin by thanking Lucas tremendously for this opportunity and thanking all the commentators for coming and engaging with my work, and thank you all for reading and coming and all this. And I thank you in advance for all that I will learn from you. So I'm very grateful. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about the book, more general background, to situate where the project is coming from. Okay, it's not in the manuscript at all, but this just gives you a sense of the questions. And then what I'm going to do is answer a bunch of questions that Lucas posed me in the pub 2 nights ago, which sets up a very general framework of definitions and philosophical, psychological, and physiological preliminaries about different sense modalities, perception, action, stuff like that, how I'm thinking about these things, so that we have a set glossary of the terms, a way to anchor the terms. And then I'll introduce the twin problems that Eylem will be commenting on. Good. So the background is the problem of action. What's the problem of action? This is explaining the contrast between what you do versus what merely happens to you, between activity and passive behavior, as it were. And there are many things one could say about this. There are experts in the room, like Eylem, who work on these issues. You might think it's exclusive and exhaustive categories. You might think it goes on a continuum, and so on and so forth. I don't want to comment on that. I merely want to observe that there's a contrast between the case of actively doing something, and there are clear cases of that, such as, giving a talk, walking down to have lunch, and there are clear cases of things which happen to you where you're passive. So cases of reflexes, for example, like the patella reflex, knee-jerk reflex. Other kinds of reflexes which involve the retina and so on and so forth. So if someone pushes you and you trip, that's also something which merely happens to you. So there seems to be clear cases on the two sides, and then the question is how you explain that contrast. Okay? And if you look at the basic categories of action, then we have, I think, 3 basic categories. Again, the idea is not that they're exclusive and exhaustive, but that they cover the ground in some way. So there's mental actions, like thought, thinking, calculating, reasoning, attending, and so on and so forth. You have bodily actions, purposive movement of your body in certain ways. So Aristotle said we are rational self-movers. And finally, there's a category of action, I think, that's not particularly discussed in the philosophical literature, but which is, when you point it out, is open to view. So it's the idea that certain actions are psychophysical in character. For example, in talking to you, I'm expressing and articulating my thought partly through the receptacle of moving my mouth and my articulating my tongue. It seems distinctively psychophysical. There's a psychological component which is essential to the physical movement as it is. Okay? And various other expressive acts have that same character, for example, gestures. So these categories of action, and I'm going to focus on the problem of action with respect to the bodily aspect, purposive movement. And the question I want to ask, in a way, the background question, is a Kantian question by inspiration in its character. So I want to ask a question about conditions of possibility. How is bodily action possible? Okay. And I want to focus on one aspect of the conditions of possibility. And the question there I want to ask is the body figuring in some way as a condition of possibility of bodily action? And if it's figuring, in what way is it figuring? Okay? So the question, as I want to pose it, goes something like this. Does an agent need to be in touch with or represent her body in some way in order to act with it? Okay? So this is a yes-no question. And you could say yes, in which case then your project begins and you have to sort of get off and start answering in which way you have to represent your body in order to act with it. Or you could say no, explain why. Okay? So in order to motivate my project, that embodied agency involves this idea of acting with your body, and this requires sensing your body in some way, then I have to argue against the answer that says no. Okay? So luckily there are some people who say no, otherwise it would be more intellectual position. It would still be interesting. So the people who say no, the people who have worked it out the most are equilibrium point theories of motor control. I think that the psychologists in the room will be familiar with these things. And the general contention is that in these equilibrium point theories of motor control, the way they think about movement is that you think of the body as a kind of spring system, okay, as a spring system. So what's distinctive of a spring system? When you have a spring, if you stretch it, you let go, it goes back to the same length. Yeah? You squish it, you let go, it goes back to the same length. Okay? Yeah? Now, no matter how much you squish it or you stretch it, up to a certain point, it goes back to the same length. Okay? So the thought here is that these theories want to exploit the idea that you don't actually need to have proprioceptive or any kind of bodily representation in order to do the transport of bodily effectors. All you need is to set the tensile variable for some kind of constant that explains the length of the effector system. Okay? So once you have that, then you have a kind of reaching system which works like a spring. Okay? You just need to set the appropriate endpoint, which is the equilibrium point, and no matter where your limb is, it will magically end up at the endpoint that you set if all things are going well. Okay? Is that clear? Okay. So on that picture, you don't need any kind of representation of the current position of your limb at all in order to have movement. All you need to know is maybe something like the length of the limb, some kind of dynamic variables, which are long-term variables. And then all you need to know is the endpoint you want to go to. Okay. And in the 60s and the 70s, there was some kind of evidence for this kind of theories coming out from monkey work at MIT and elsewhere, and the mathematical foundations of this were done in Russia by people who won the Stalin Prize and so on and so forth, Feldman and other people, a little bit from Bernstein as well. And the thought was that you have various shortcuts for the control of action so that you can cut down on the representational load generally. And one set of experiments that was very important in this connection were a set of experiments done at MIT by Bidzi and his colleagues. So what they did was to train a monkey in this kind of apparatus to point at one of these lights when they came on. Okay? In this apparatus, the monkey does not see his limb. Okay, there's this, the head is popping out, does not see the limb, and one of the lights goes on, and then the monkey has to just move the limb to where the light is. Okay? And then if it's correct, monkey gets a juice to squirt. And the monkey is very happy and next round, so on and so forth. Yeah. Okay. So the monkeys are then trained to do this task, as you would expect. They can do it very well if they get the correct kind of juice. And then they do something horrible to the monkey. Okay? They de-efferent the monkey. So they remove proprioception from this arm. Okay? The pointing arm, from the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. What happens at that point is the monkey gets to rest for a bit, and then they start to do this same experiment again. Light comes on, can they point to it? Okay, they want the juice reward. Turns out monkey can do this perfectly well in this apparatus. Okay, and that was taken as a demonstration that it's possible to perform these rather complex actions in the absence of proprioception. So it's taken to support equilibrium point theory. Yep, okay, very nice. Turns out that once you slightly perturb the position of the arm for the monkey cannot adjust or compensate for any of these perturbations. In a way, it's not surprising because he can't see the arm, doesn't feel the arm, so how would he ever know how to compensate, right? Therefore, once you perturb the arm position a little bit, you put the elbow forward and so on and so forth, they can no longer do this pointing cast and they get very upset, they don't get the juice reward, they rebel and so on and so forth. Okay. So it seems that proprioception, it's not the case that proprioception has no role to play in action. It seems to have some role to play in action. And you also see this in cases of the afferented agents. So this is the famous de-afferented agent, IW. He's a patient of Jonathan Cole's. He lives in Southampton. He was a butcher in the Jersey Islands. And one day he got a kind of virus, which basically ate up all his large myelinated nerves. What that meant was that he could have outgoing signals controlling his limbs, but no incoming signals. So up to the collarbone line, he has no proprioception or touch. Okay? So after a while, when he couldn't even sit and so on and so forth, he has great strength of will and he relearned how to walk by using visual attention to control his limbs. So here you can see IW walking. I think it's out of St. Paul's station. And here you can see him picking up an egg. Now the interesting thing about the afferented agents is that even though they can act, they suffer from very severe deficits in the online control of action. So what this shows is that even though as a source it's substitutable, it has a distinctive role to play in the capacity for action control in normal agents. Okay? So this seems to once again indicate that proprioception is in some way special. Okay. So there's more I could say against equilibrium point theory. So if you look at research on Coriolis forces and compensation under certain conditions, you also see that there are problems with equilibrium point theories and the predictions that they make, but we won't talk about this. Okay, so now I assume that equilibrium point theories are wrong. Remember, we had the fork between yes and no answers for whether an agent needs to represent the body, and now we are in the yes fork because we have pushed aside the no fork. Okay, and now we can then ask the question, how does an agent need to be in touch with her body in order to activate it? Okay. And as Matt's talk would have suggested, there are many possible answers. There's vision, there's audition, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what's special about, what kind of representation of the body do you need? Because there are many possible answers. So here the strategy is that amongst the many possible perceptual and sensory modalities, I will try to attempt to use some kind of knockout criteria to get to my answer. That in some sense, in the articulation of the central case of normal, healthy, adult human beings, proprioception has a very distinctive kind of role. And in particular, in order to act, in order to have the capacities for ordinary bodily action that we have, the agent needs to feel her body from the inside. Okay? So proprioception has a distinctive kind of role here. And the idea of the knockout criteria is that you can knock out vision, you can knock out audition and so on and so forth, and still have that remaining. This criterion gets a little bit tricky when you consider the case of touch, because physiologically touch is linked with bodily awareness in some ways. So touch is a very special sense that links inner and outer. Okay, so once again, in what way does an agent need to be in touch with her body in order to act with it? There are two extremes of the answer. Here you could have said. So one answer is the answer that we find in the literature from the God of Action theory, Brian O'Shaughnessy. Brian O'Shaughnessy says that you always need to be in touch with your body in a conscious way, all the time and everywhere. Okay? This is Brian's considered final position. You need to be completely conscious of your body and every point on it in order to act on it. The other extreme end is to say you never have to be feeling your body from the inside in this conscious way, but you have to represent it. So there will be unconscious representations, that help you control your body, but you don't have to feel it from the inside. So one way to see that is to think of that position as represented by a theorist who thinks that the body schema is enough, unconscious body representations for action, plus the thought that this agent is what we might call, extending Ned Block's term, a super-blind proprioceptor. Okay? So if you're familiar with this bit of philosophical technology, the super-blind sighter. Now, what is a blind sighter? A blind sighter is someone who is damaged in V1 and maybe a little bit in V2, and they are clinically blind, but they have reliable guessing behavior, judgmental behavior, and action on the basis of their visual information. Now, typically they are interpreted as people who have unconscious vision, but this is becoming increasingly controversial if you look at the debates between Ned Block and Ian Phillips and other people, and I think Matt also is skeptical about the claim that it's unconscious entirely. Now, in the case of blind sight, the interesting thing is, even though these agents can tap into these features that they process and can exploit them in cognitive behavior and in action, they do not typically spontaneously do that because they don't feel it's there and so on and so forth. So Ned Block invented this philosophical piece of technology called super blind sighter. The difference between the blind sighter and the super blind sighter is that the super blind sighter is completely reliable, so just like as reliable as you or I am, and the super blind sighter has no qualms about acting on the basis of the information that he takes in. Okay? Because it's spontaneous. There's not this waiting and seeing. So, in fact, we have the two poles here, the always position from Brian O'Shaughnessy and the never position, where you have body schematic representation and the super blind proprioceptor. And my position is somewhat in between. My thought is that what's needed in order to articulate the connection is that we need centrally to have what I call a capacity for proprioception. This means that in proper functioning cases, you have an information processing capacity such that you're carrying bodily information through proprioceptive receptors and so on and so forth. And in some core cases, you have some conscious awareness of these events in some way. So the capacity is articulated in such a way that its proper functioning involves both unconscious and conscious aspects. Okay? So this is the middle position. And it's an interesting aspect of my project that even though I describe it as a transcendental project of sorts, it's a scope-restricted transcendental project. So maybe I shouldn't call it a transcendental project. It's a project in conditions of possibility that has a scope restriction. Namely, I want to articulate what is philosophically substantive and explanatory about a paradigm case of adult human agents. Okay. So that's the kind of backdrop to the book. And just to introduce the book, it's got, at the moment, it's got 10 chapters and 3 parts. The first part gives the core account, which happens in the next 2 sessions with in discussions with Aram and with Matt. So we look at 2 problems concerning bodily awareness in action and the body schema. They're both pooling in different ways, and I give the capacity account in the 3rd chapter. So that's the account of embodied action. Once we have this core account in play, then we have to look at what embodied life is like. Okay, so the second part is on embodied life, and here I have chapters on interoception, ownership of the body, acting with the body that you own, and on the vestibular system. So embodied life is a bit richer. It doesn't really get to really interesting parts of life, but I'm a philosopher. I never get to the interesting parts. And finally, once we get embodied life, we even get something spiritual. So we have transubstantiation. And here I discuss what it means to be embodied, what it means to be a self in work with Christina Orban, and I draw the consequences of the type of account I've given for a debate in the philosophy of psychology and philosophy of mind about the interaction between personal and subpersonal levels of explanation. So that's the shape of the book. And the first part gives you a core account of how proprioception shapes action. The second part gives you an account of how complex bodily awareness shapes action and agency. And the third part gives you an account of how a body becomes a bodily self. Okay, now I've taken 20 minutes already for this part. Should I skip the glossary and just go on to talk about Ilam's part?
Elam, how long do you need to talk for? Half an hour?
Not that much. I mean, yeah, maybe.
Well, yeah, I think you should carry on. I mean, people are happy.
Yeah.
We should have a little buzzer, so that when 5 people, like, you know, in these comedy shows, sometimes you have the kind of open mic night, and if 5 people put up a reject sign, the beeper goes. So, no, let's carry on.
Okay.
Or squirt juice. Yeah, or squirt juice. Or stop squirting juice. Yeah.
Okay, so now that I've given you a kind of synopsis of the project, now I'm just going to set up some terms so that we can be on the same page, because I do things in a very peculiar kind of way, and not everyone might agree with the kind of background that I'm coming from. But I take it that the kind of background I'm coming from is ultimately quite minimal. So I'm not coming from East Coast representationalism or some very fixed kind of view of things. I want to take the most minimal anchor point we have, but have anchor points all over the place and try to run from there. Okay, so I think we have psychologists around as well, so it's good to fix on what we mean by action and perception, because psychologists always want you to have definitions. These are not definitions, but they are glosses. So they are so vague that I think some of my colleagues will want to whip me, but I think this is what I will commit myself to. So action, roughly, is an active output process that is goal-directed and controlled by the agent, personal level phenomena, and the capacity to act is reasons responsive in adult human beings. Okay, so that's roughly what I mean by action. Perception turns out to be much more difficult to define for me. Roughly, it's an input process that in core cases of proper functioning may involve sensory experience of the object of experience. Okay? Yes. And in some modalities, this may involve representational structures underlying perceptual constancies, such as color constancy, spatial constancy, and so on and so forth. So this is the understanding of action and perception. Yes?
The question, could you more clearly explain what you mean by representational structures? Are you referring to physiological structures, relational structures?
So you can substitute representational with computational. I would be okay with it. So
I wouldn't.
okay. So there are just informational aspects which allow you to compute things such that you have some kind of invariance from varying stimulus conditions, and you have some kind of perceptual constancy. So if you believe in perceptual constancies, then simply substitute whatever is your favorite explanation for perceptual constancies there, and then I'm okay. Would that be okay?
We can discuss this.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, this understanding of action and perception. And now I'm just going to go through a list of the bodily senses. This is basically taken from Frederick Devinemont's Stanford Encyclopedia article and summarized, okay? Just to give you a sense of the major, yes,
Can I just ask about the perception? It's not supposed to be a definition, right? That
no, it's supposed to be a gloss.
Is there a definition coming up, or is this?
No, I don't like definitions, don't believe in definitions, don't believe anyone has ever given successful definitions except for things like bachelor.
So this is about input processes, right? And some of them are called active perception.
Yeah, it's about processes in the real world, and some are action processes, some are perceptual processes.
And it doesn't involve consciousness.
May involve sensory experience.
It doesn't, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Yeah. And what I'm doing here with this business here of hedging in core cases of proper functioning may involve is that there are some channels that are almost constantly unconscious, like the vestibular system. And so there are also cases of vestibular functioning which is conscious. But so I want to allow for room that a sense could have in its proper functioning almost no conscious instances, and yet it still be a perceptual sense. So in a longer treatment, you would have things like discussions of the possibility of illusions, intentionality of the modality, and certain kinds of informational structures which would allow for invariance of sorts, such that you get constancies out. And then the further question is whether the constancies would be necessary for each and every sense, or whether you just need constancies for some senses and so on and so forth.
Yeah, maybe we should leave off the questions till afterwards, because we're at this one, because it's the first one, it's a bit longer. So.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to go through the different bodily senses so that we have them all on the table, and then they can be all used for discussion. So all this is from Frederick de Villemain, but I agree with all of them. So they're all quoted from the Stanford Encyclopedia article. So touch, so I'm going to go through the physiological aspects of it and also some psychological and phenomenological aspects. So touch is mediated by cutaneous mechanoreceptors for pressure and things like that, and carries information both about the external world and about the body. It's something observed by the phenomenological psychologist Katz in 1925 in this fantastic book called The World of Touch, which I recommend. And many properties are processed by touch, including texture, temperature, solidity, humidity, contact, weight, pressure, force, vibration, etc. Okay? As touch, what's proprioception? Proprioception provides information about the position and movement of the body, and the mechanisms of proprioception include muscle spindles, which are sensitive to muscle stretch. So these are spindles in the muscles themselves. And then there are Golgi tendon organs. These are all in the cells, which are sensitive to tendon tension, and joint receptors, which are sensitive to joint position. So together they give you a sense of joint position and movement. Okay? So all this is on the slides, you can download it. And the vestibular system in the inner ear provides information about balance, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow. Roughly what you have is you have organs for sensing angular acceleration for when you move your head like this, and then you have another set of organs for sensing gravity and linear acceleration. Then you have pain receptors, nociceptors, which respond to dangerously intense mechanical stimuli, to mechano-thermal stimuli, or to thermal and chemical stimuli, such as acids and so on and so forth. And finally, you have a category that's become very important in recent psychology and neuroscience, called interoception. Not introspection, but interoception. And it's a kind of sense about your visceral organs, okay? So this provides information about physiological condition of the body in order to maintain optimal homeostasis. And you have cardiovascular, respiratory energy balances. And the parasympathetic system is sensitive to mechanical, thermal, chemical, metabolic, and hormonal status of skin, muscle, joints, teeth, and viscera. Okay? So you have all these different senses. Okay? Just to be complete, because I know Lucas is as much of a Kantian as a cognitive scientist, we're going to look at the information processing underlay. So basically what you have is you have the initial processing station in the thalamus, and then this is conveyed into the associated parietal cortex, S1 and so on, that goes to S2. And then you have, within a kind of model that is quite similar to the dual visual systems model, you have a kind of area which sends off stuff for conscious processing and memory, and another area for action control. So the action control area is here, body image, and the other one here is for tactile object recognition. And you have another complication in terms of exploratory hand movement. So the areas are not incredibly separated in terms of the neural underpinnings, but you have lesion studies that can separate these kinds of different capacities. Okay? And here's a diagram showing you roughly the major areas involved. So you have the premotor area, the operculum, the superior parietal cortex, S1 and also S2, posterior parietal cortex for multisensory integration, insula for interoceptive processing, and the brainstem. Okay, so the major papers to read for this are Dickerman and Dehaan's BBS paper, and more recent paper is by Mosley's group. Okay, once you have all this, then the core thing I want to get at is the phenomenology of embodiment and how the functional linkages between the capacities come together to create the kind of possibilities of ordinary bodily action that we have. And at the core of this is what I call the non-pilot phenomenology, basically inherited from Descartes. And Descartes focuses on the first condition, that you experience your body in a kind of distinctive kind of way. So you experience your body from the inside and not just as one material object amongst others. So it's the only object that you experience in this way. It's the only object you experience pain, hunger, proprioception, interoception, and so on. Now, if you take Descartes' denial that he is like a pilot in a ship in the sixth meditation, you can apply it also to action. So if you think about action, your body is the only body that you can act with in this kind of distinctive way. Okay? So if you wanted to act with other bodies, you typically have to do it first by acting through your body. Okay? There are these newfangled cases of brain-computer interfaces and chips and so on and so forth. But I think in the core case, it is true that your body is a distinctive object that only you can act with in that way. Okay? I think I won't talk about this, even though this is a slide for Lucas. Okay, once we have that, I want to make a set of distinctions about different types of representations that will allow me to make my view manifest. Because usual discussions in the cognitive sciences are not in terms, at least in the philosophy of cognitive science, are not in terms of capacities. It's always in terms of representations of content. Now, in order to capture the distinctive pattern of dissociations and associations that you get, I think, in ordinary agency, what we need is some notion of a capacity that's operative and so on, but isn't necessarily always or currently present, as it were. Okay, the capacity is present, but it may not be conscious, for example. So then I have a set of different distinctions, which are extended from a set of distinctions from this wonderful book from Aylan, Bermudez, and Marcel, The Body and the Self, that kicked off a lot of this debate from '95. So this is just terminology. So proprioceptive systems are channels providing information about the body deriving from bodily receptors. Once you have this notion of proprioceptive systems, then you can define the notion of proprioceptive information. So it's just any information that concerns the body, regardless of whether it derives from proprioceptive systems. So vision can provide you, for example, with proprioceptive information by this. Now we have a notion of proprioceptive awareness, and that's understood as conscious experience of the body from the inside in this proprioceptive sense. Okay? And then now we have some notion in order to capture the representational computational structure, and these are proprioceptive representations. These are the representations underlying the functioning of proprioceptive systems. And proprioceptive representations can carry proprioceptive information, at least partly derived from proprioceptive systems. So this is the allow for multimodality. And plus, I want to say that some proprioceptive representations are potentially conscious. Okay? And once we have that in view, I can then string together a notion of the capacity for proprioception, okay? Which is what I need in order to get this in-between view between always and never. And this is the idea that the capacity for proprioception is grounded in the having of proprioceptive representations, some of which are potentially conscious. And these representations which are potentially conscious, when they are conscious, they are manifest in proprioceptive awareness. Okay. So that's the idea.
So here the proprioceptive representations is in the distinction 1-2 sense or in the distinction 1-3 sense? So the idea is that does it matter where the representations are coming from?
Representations are coming from proprioceptive information. And then
in any information come from regardless of the proprioceptive systems themselves at all. You see that?
Proprioceptive. So
you see what I'm trying to get at? The capacity for proprioception if.
So these always have to be partly derived from proprioceptive systems.
Right.
And because of this always has to be derived from proprioceptive systems, because this is, I'm exploiting the proprioceptive representations here.
Okay, so proprioceptive representations are not proprioceptive information. It's the one type of proprioceptive information that comes from proprioceptive systems particularly.
Yes,
Okay, right,
that's
thanks.
right. Okay, good. Any questions or clarification? Good. Okay. Now I finished the setup, and now I'm going to, in 10 minutes, set up the two problems, and then let ILM shoot when we come to office. Okay. So the first chapter is setting up what I call the problem of bodily awareness in action. And this comes from setting up the Cartesian phenomenology once again. It's phenomenology of this distinctive sense that only you can feel your body from the inside, and this distinctive sense that only you can act with your body directly. And by acting directly with your body, I mean this sense of a teleologically basic action, okay, for the initiates. I mean, intuitively, it's just this difference, okay? So I can raise my left hand by going like this, or I can raise my left hand when my left hand, say, is limp, by going like this, okay? I use my right hand to raise my left hand. Okay, so acting directly is like being able to do this, okay, intuitively. Okay, so this sets up the phenomenology, and we already talked about the afferented agents. And what the afferented agents shows that there is a kind of contrast between us and people who don't have so much proprioception, in the way that when IW acts, he has to pay conscious visual attention to his effectors as he walks. Okay, so this is very different from the kind of ordinary fluid action that we have. So one instance demonstrating why he has to use conscious visual attention to do his to perform his action is that if you use a standard dwell task paradigm for attention, so for example, attention demanding task together with another task, you can test. If you can do the second task very well, performance doesn't degrade, then the thought is that it doesn't require much attention. Okay, yeah, good. So the task that they did with IW was counting backwards from very high numbers. Okay, this is quite difficult. Maybe some of you are mathematical geniuses like Ilan, you can count backwards really well. But generally, if you count backwards from very high numbers, whatever other thing you're doing degrades very fast. Try doing this the next time you have a conversation on the iPhone. Okay? Try counting backwards while you're talking with your friend, and you immediately see your speech goes to gibberish. Okay? So this indicates that he needs attention, and the way he acts indicates that he is in a way like a Cartesian pilot in his body vessel. Okay, so this gives us a kind of contrast. It suggests that the way we can act with our body, that it's not like a form of remote control, is because we have proprioception. Okay, so then this allows me to mount an argument from contrast that proprioception seems to play a role in the distinctive way we control our actions. Okay, and this has three aspects. The first is the observation of basic action, that you can directly act with your body in the way you can do this. Okay? And the second observation is that in this transaction of acting directly with your body, the body isn't a target object. Okay, it's what you immediately act with. So one way to contrast the body as a target object. So this is a term that O'Shaughnessy used. So he said, why do you have to be always conscious of your body in acting? Because you have to have a target object for the bodily will. Okay. So first comes consciousness. It has this kind of like halo thing, and it kind of puts the crosshairs on the part of your body that you need to act with. So here's your foot, and then here's consciousness. It says you want to wiggle your toes, and then puts the crosshairs on that. And then once it says that, boom, that's attention, and then there you go with the rest of the mechanisms. Okay, so that's why it's a target object. But I'm saying no, ordinary action isn't like that. Body is not a target object. Okay? It's the immediate effect of the action. And notice that conscious attentional control of our effectors is not typically required. We normally don't pay attention to our effectors as we are acting, except when you're learning or performing some new action or something like that. Okay? So typically, you're paying attention to something else. If I were to pay attention to each one of my movements as per Alexander technique, as I were giving a talk, I wouldn't know what I was saying. Okay? Maybe some people can do that. Maybe dancers. Now, Once we have these properties, then we can compare and contrast afferentation and de-afferentation. So here is our global genius, Albert Einstein on a bicycle, versus IW walking. Okay, so in cases like that, you see there's an individual with intact proprioception, and here you have an individual with a loss of proprioception and touch. And on the left, you have an individual when they have intact proprioception, that they have effortless action without attention, and this is not the case on the right-hand side for the afferented individuals, where you need to have effortful, controlled action via visual attention. And then you can further observe that you have fluid online control in the first case and severe problems with online control on the other case. So this suggests that because the main difference between these two groups is the absence of presence of proprioception, that proprioception is in a way crucial for our ordinary capacity for action. Okay, so that's the thing. And I codify it in this thesis, if one weren't aware, called not remote control. If one weren't aware of one's body from the inside, then acting with it would be like a form of remote control. Okay. Okay, good. So this indicates that proprioception is involved, but then we have a kind of we have one kind of contrast. So this might indicate that consciousness is always required. Okay, like O'Shaughnessy kind of argued for through this kind of target-object account. But I think that the account that consciousness is always required is open to various empirical counterexamples. So you have the case of de-afferented agents, we already saw that. And if you look at normal agents, you also have action under proprioceptive illusion. So what are some cases of that? So here's a proprioceptive illusion. You have rubber hand illusion. Those of you who don't know it, this is how it looks. He can't see this hand. This is his biological hand. He's looking at this hand. It's being stroked. And so typically in these instances, if you ask them to point where their hand is without looking, the felt position of the hand migrates toward the rubber hand. Okay, so you have a proprioceptive illusion here. Now what happens when you actually ask people to act with or on the hands is that basically you find that in this instance, the proprioceptive illusion does not affect the action. Okay? So it seems that the conscious awareness of conscious proprioceptive awareness of arm position, this illusory thing, is not affecting the action control in this instance. Okay. There are other cases of these experiments, for example, Marcel's vibrotactile experiments, but I won't discuss these. Okay, let's skip this. Okay, so given that, we have the shape of the first problem. On the one hand, from the contrast between afferented and de-afferented agents, it shows that proprioception is crucial. But if you look at the experimental challenges to why proprioception is crucial, it seems that very often you get dissociations between awareness and performance. Okay, so you have this apparent conflict between the manifest image and scientific image concerning the role of bodily awareness in action. A manifest image appears to be committed to bodily awareness being intimately involved in the control of action, but dissociations from experimental and pathological cases challenge this control. So how do we bring these two sides together? So that's the first problem. Okay? The second problem starts by showing how action is possible under conditions of proprioceptive illusions and other kinds of pathologies and unusual instances. So how is bodily action possible? Effective action is possible because there are bodily representations which provide accurate spatial parameters of one's bodily effectors. And this is often called the body schema. Further, I observed that it's multimodal, so I call it the multimodal body schema. And what is the body schema? So typically, you remember the kind of distinction I had before about when I had the neural processing diagram for the somatosensory processing pathways. So you have a dissociation between body image and body schema, such that body image is the conscious somatosensory perception, and body schema is the unconscious somatosensory perception used for the control of action. So this is what we have here. So it's a system of subpersonal motor capacities that enable movement and the maintenance of posture. So observation. Since it's responsible for the online control of action, it should be optimal so that we can get the best possible estimate of limb position as the action unfolds, because it's a dynamic thing and we want to control it well. Now, since it should be optimal, it should draw on multiple sources of information so that it can eliminate irregularities between different kinds of sources and reduce variance. Okay, so this indicates that multimodality is part of the proper functioning of the body schema. But there's been skepticism about the body schema because this is a little bit like the kind of normative virtue kind of thing. That they use body schema as a label for a set of problems rather than as a solution. I think that's true. So given that it's been used problematically so far, the way to answer this is by providing a functional argument for body schema. Okay, so I'm going to provide a functional argument in 2 minutes. Okay, so there are 3 basic arguments. One is from motor control. This is Nikolai Bernstein, Stalin Prize awardee. So his thought, not about the body schema, but about motor control, was that if you think about motor control, how is motor control possible? Because there are way too many muscles and joints and degrees of freedom in the body. So if each one had to be controlled individually, it would result in this massive computational explosion. It would be impossible. So first of all, what you need is some kind of motor hierarchy so that different things get organized within the hierarchy so that you have increasingly less nodes to control and that the top nodes program the bottom nodes in some way so that you have a kind of hierarchical system. Now, once you have that, then the thought is that some of these parameters which you have in order to feed the hierarchical motor system must be such that they have an automatic update of body position. And the schema is there to do. Okay, that's the first thought. Second thought, when you look at perception-action dissociations, like the rubber hand kind of action dissociation we saw just now, you have effective action under illusory conditions of perception. Now that means that somewhere, somehow, there must be something accurate driving the action. Okay, what's that? Hypothesis, body schema. Okay, same thing is solving the degrees of freedom problem at the bottom of the hierarchy as the perception-action dissociations. Third point, if you look at body extensions, such as tool use, you find that there is rapid incorporation of tools into the body. How is that possible? Answer, body schema. These other things are represented as extensions of the body. Okay, so that's the thought. Once you have these 3 arguments, you have a functional conception of what's required for this kind of thing. And this, given that we need to perform these tasks, there seems to be a good argument for there being a body schema. I won't go through the more specific version of the arguments now, but I want to raise the challenge. Okay. So the shape of the answer has been, the question has been, how is bodily action possible? And we look at all these cases, and the answer is, because there is the multimodal body schema. Now, but then you want to ask, this guy started by talking about the body and sensing the body and proprioception. Now he's gone all multimodal. Did he forget what he started talking about in the beginning? Yeah, maybe, but... Okay, so what's the role of proprioception? Question. Is it just one among several collateral sources of information about bodily effectors, the presence of which contributes to a better spatial estimate? So do we have a kind of additive summation conception of the presence of proprioception, or does it have a more special role? That's the question here. Now, response. If proprioception were just one source among several, then it would be hard to be hard to explain why the afferentation is so debilitating. Okay, why can't you simply replace it? So I think I want to discuss this. one way to see what's going wrong in the afferent patients is that even though they have a multimodal body schema, it now needs to be grounded on visual input and other kinds of previous input from somatic sources. But we see that once they lack proprioceptive input into the body schema, their performance on online control and ordinary bodily action drops dramatically. So you can ask, what about the lack of proprioceptive input to the body schema explains why the character of the afferent action is so different from ordinary bodily action? Is it simply because of the difference in pervasiveness of proprioception and vision? Because proprioception is constantly there, even if you don't want it to be. So it's sort of like the vestibular sense. It's constantly working in the background. Now, if you don't want to look at things, you just close your eyes or put on a blindfold or something like that. But you can't do that with proprioception. You will have to inject yourself with some kind of substance. Okay. Now, I think it's not. And one way to see that is to contrast our action. Contrast the action of blind agents versus the action of the afferented agents. So in a way, in terms of fluidity, the fluidity with which they can act with their own body, but not external objects, blind agents are able to act with their bodies just like sighted agents. They can very easily manipulate parts of their body. Okay, they can scratch and itch easily and so on, even though they make more errors because there is less information available. But if you look at the afferented agents, that's not the case. So in blind agents, the loss of vision doesn't result in a change in the character of bodily striving. They don't become, as it were, pilots in ships in the way the afferented agents do. Okay? So the thought is that if you look at this contrast, then you see that proprioceptive loss is not simply a loss of one source of information about one's body amongst others, and that proprioception is a source that shapes the very character of ordinary bodily action, and that further work is required for saying what exactly proprioception is doing. So in terms of the problem, it's this. On the one hand, body perception must be multimodal for effective action. On the other hand, if body perception is multimodal, then in what sense is proprioception a special source? Okay, so those are the two problems. Thank you. Sorry for going on for such a long time.
So maybe, can I also use the same computer instead of trying to set this up? Perhaps it's easier.
And maybe we should. We've only got 3 talks this afternoon, and because this was the first one, we went on a bit longer, so we'll finish a little bit late, so there will be time for questions. Yeah, so we should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's probably a good actually.
Scary.
Hello, blunt.
Clumsy for sure.
So we have to first need to go here, so just make it this. Running. Running it's common zone here. Animation for reply.
Alright, so first of all, thanks Lucas and the whole team for organizing this and for everyone coming. Well, I have basically actually, I don't think I will say anything that you didn't see coming, right? So most of it will be about just like, can you tell us more about this? Why it is not like this? Because it looks like this. And when I'm trying to say that why it's not like this, that this will be put very bluntly, okay? But I'm sure you have, it's not what you say, but I want to hear more about why what you say is not just what I say, okay? So that's the structure. So yeah, there's like,
I don't, so somebody should keep eye on the time, and then I don't need to go over all, I can just stop at 3 or something, right? So just you let me know. So, right, and sometimes I will be referring to Wong 2015 instead of chapters 1 and 2, because I start working on exam, but, right, so here's the setup as I understand. So that the general setup is that there is this feeling, which is one experiences one's body and its parts from inside, and not just as one material object among others. And there is this another thing called direct action. One can directly act with one's body, before close to this action in a way that one cannot let any other place. And now the main question is that how these two are related, right? So basically, I will say something about feeling, and I will say something about direct action, and I will say basically, because of the things I say about these two, well, then I will say maybe this is not so my main objection about feeling is that feeling, it seems to be very underspecified. So one say bodily awareness is conscious experience of the body from the inside. So basically, it's just one point. Like, we need something more than a metaphor to make any good on this claim. So we might say, well, what is unclear about from the inside? Well, first of all, perceptual awareness of oneself as one acts by 5 senses, because we also use our normal 5 senses, not just proprioception, when we are acting bodily. And I am also aware of myself through those other sense modalities as well. And when I'm aware of myself through these other 5 senses, other modalities, they are not given to me, not necessarily at least, as a third personal monitoring. So bodily representations provided by 5 senses, which are utilized in action, most of the time do not represent the body as an object among many. So there's called perspectival monitoring, and perspectival monitoring is first personal, not necessarily reflective, and intrinsic to the action process. Now, if that is the case, then from inside cannot mean first personal, because first personal can be got to other senses as well. So it's not first personal, okay? And so what is it? We don't know.
What you point out here is that I'm missing a step. So what the step that I forgot to include is that once you have the functional arguments, then you can then see what satisfies that. And that's, you find evidence for that through the neurophysiological double dissociations. Yes. So once you do the functional arguments, you can then look for what satisfies the functional role, and then you get a triangulation of what would do that by looking at double dissociations from neuropsychology, and then you know what kind of area is doing this work, and you can make predictions on that kind of thing, and therefore that will be explaining why you have some kind of functional capacity that's realized in a certain kind of way that answers to these things. Because this was their problem was it could be a set of different kind of capacities and completely involve different brain regions whatsoever. And I take it by putting these functional arguments together, it made certain predictions. It turned out to be good because, you know, philosophy are doing retrospectively anyways. I'm trying to fit the data. And so I take it that I've answered that. It's no longer just a normative virtue kind of business. That's the structure here. Okay. So I can definitely answer this, for example.
Yeah, okay, good. Because from the definition, I don't see how it would work. Like, I couldn't make the link, like how that will be applied in such a way to exclude some of the possibilities that I wasn't able to see.
Yeah. So the definitions are very hard to do, but once you do the functional arguments, then you can look at the realizers. And then based on that and looking at double dissociations and experimental dissociations, you can then separate different kinds of things like body image and schema. And in fact, my current view is that I don't like this dichotomy because I think it's much more plastic. I think there are two attractors which roughly fall into what people have talked about in terms of body image and body schema, but it's much more fluid.
Okay, good.
But still there's a kind of functional attractor that's in charge of online control and stuff like that. That's realized in the posterior parietal cortex, and that's involved in certain things like afferent copy and so on and so forth. So that's this. Good. This, I have an excuse, which may not be an exculpation. This was because for about 5 years, John McDowell and Jen Hornsby kept saying this to me.
Right, Bell. Yeah. You said that. You said that, but I don't see, because disjunctivist arguments, right? Don't carry out immediately. I thought about this. I am a disjunctivist for one. I couldn't find how it would carry out, because in disjunctivism case, you take the failure case, right, and you find something in that, and you build the success case from that, and then disjunctivist comes and says, well, success case can have a very different structure, but the differentials is not like that. There's both success cases, so I do not see how a disjunctivist argument will help you.
It's not just a direct disjunctivist.
Exactly.
It's the idea of when it's a more Aristotelian strand in your thought, that there are certain kinds of core exemplars of things. And when you take a disease case of an instance of the species that belongs to this kind of thing, you're taking an instance that doesn't necessarily shed light on the structure of the core, what the core exemplar looks like. That's all. If nothing, so my account doesn't hang on this in a way. It's just so that's why I have more dialectical resources against these kinds of accounts. So I don't need necessity to come out true.
Okay, because I mean, you said that I will just do, just like the normal cases, I will just normal. But I'm just saying, when you look, confine things to the normal case, right? You still want to make certain things are actually dependent on certain things.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So again, those they will put some pressure on them, because there are cases showing that they are not done with, they can be done without that. So what sort of dependency is that in those cases we rely on proprioception? Well, nobody would deny that. We all know that we are relying on proprioception in normal cases. The issue is that whether we have to, whether it's central, right? That I don't know how we get to we have to, just by looking at the cases that it is used. See, the same problem will come back.
Not necessarily, because you don't just have to show that it's used, you have to show that it's used in a way that's substantive in providing an explanation of the central instance. Such that the very character of the explanation of the central instance relies crucially on its being like that.
Right, but at that character it turned out to be only phenomenological character.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that point now.
Okay, good.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Oh, that was later. It's conclusion one, after the scope. Yeah, here it is.
Okay, good. So I think in the paper, in the chapter, I misstated that it's primarily explaining the phenomenology. It should be a causal, functional, and phenomenological claim.
That's right. But the thing is, everything you say is that, well, it is very different, and what we're looking what is different is just the phenomenological difference. So
no, because the functional aspect
again,
is different too.
But the functional aspects might be different because of the content of the information.
That's fine. I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Feeling from the inside. So this is what Lucas was troubling me with the other day as well. And it turns out that the Istanbul line is very similar.
We didn't talk about that.
I know.
Yeah.
But it's the Istanbul world spirit. So the world spirit in Istanbul has a modulation concerning from the inside. So the way I'm using it, I just meant it to. I wasn't using from the inside and outside in a major contrastive way. So if I just had to call it proprioception, it would be fine too. So I'm just using feeling one's body from the inside to pick up whatever it is we do with proprioception.
Including the content.
Including content, yes.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think you both read it as much richer. And so in some of the phenomenologists, they have this inside and outside. And in Mike Martin, you find traces of that too, that the inside and outside and this differentiation is very important in some way, such that you have some understanding of the self-other boundary and stuff like that. It's not playing any role except in the language. So it's not playing any role in the argument.
Right,
because so the content point precisely by, which is why I came up with all those things. But it's what I'm trying is to peg it simply down to proprioception.
Okay, because you said it's from inside, not one object among many, but like.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
We'll come to that now.
So you see all of them are like dominoes.
Yeah, that's philosophy. It has to be like dominoes, otherwise it's not fun. Okay, so because of what you said, I think I have to rework the way I set up the feeling and direct action. I agree with both your criticisms. So feeling has to be characterized simply just as proprioception and how proprioception.
Much more helpful it will be, yeah?
Yeah, excellent, good. And then the direct action, your point is exactly right. So I should just say that in some sense of a core instance, you can act directly. There's some sense in which, so I have to drop the only claim where the body is the only object that you can act with teleologically, basically. But I can still say it's in some sense a basic aspect of acting with your body, that you have that kind of ability to teleologically act with your body. And I use this kind of case to do the contrast. So I agree with those points. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I disagree with the tool point. I think that's a chasm.
Which point?
The body as a tool.
Uh-huh.
That's a chasm between us.
Right. Yeah. So that's the thing about like how much like the when you take the teleological, right? How much that the teleological things also like the way in which practical reason engage with the world, right? How much we put on that. I think that will differentiate those, but that's a bigger point. But yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's move to questions.
How would you place the response of the mirror cells to someone else's action in your theory? Would you just categorize it as something like the rubber hand, an illusion?
No. But in fact, in my account, I don't have to pronounce on what mirror neurons are doing. So, but I don't. It's a motor simulation. Motor simulation.
No.
It's motor simulation. It doesn't have to be illusion. It becomes an illusion in some cases. In some people who so for example, there's forms of touch synesthesia, such that if say Lucas has this form of synesthesia and he sees me touch here, he will feel that he's being touched there. So there are forms of synesthesia, and in those cases that would be counted as an illusion. But the mirror neuron representations wouldn't be counted as illusory, because it's merely a vehicle for the processing that goes on to it.
Because I find it particularly interesting because of this notion of feeling from the inside. It's something as if you are feeling from the inside of someone else. So actually it's, in a way, you are perceiving the action without the actor, or without the subject.
Yes,
so maybe the notion in the body schema, the multimodality is important here, because this is just one of the modes. So without the other clues from the other modes, you cannot conclude the subject whose body and whose sensation it is. But this is just one component, one mode. Could we say that?
A couple of things. First of all, I think it's already hard to do the theory of content at the personal level, and nobody has any theory of content of what's going on at the subpersonal level. Okay, nobody. And I think there's one philosopher working on it now, Nick Shea. He's trying to write a book on subpersonal content by looking at the case of cognitive maps and stuff like that. This is the first instance I've heard of someone trying to work out specifically what's happening. So I don't know I wouldn't want to ascribe exactly what's happening in the content. But in terms of what you said, this kind of proposal has been put forward by Janero, amongst other people, that when you have these kinds of mirror neuron-like systems, he called it in the 90s a who system. So what you detect are these agentless representations, and then you have a who system that plasters on the agent onto it. But I think most of these things are non-experiential. So most of mirror neuron activation is just happening way below the personal level.
Okay, that was another question.
Okay. So thank you very much. It's really helpful. I think I understand better what you're doing, and thank you for the comments. So about Descartes, proprioception, O'Shaughnessy, just one question. So the quote from Descartes, everyone gets it wrong. They say that I'm not a pilot in the ship. It actually says I'm not only a pilot in the ship. So I am a pilot in the ship, but I'm not just a pilot in the ship. Now, so what? So it seems that maybe your view is actually a bit Cartesian in the end, in a sense that you would also say that I'm not only a pilot in the ship, but you still are kind of a pilot in a ship, because, and this has to do with O'Shaughnessy, proprioception is basic, but it's not maybe basic enough, since you grant these possibilities of what was the name for the de-apparentiated subjects, right? So in that case, if you end up being de-apparentiated, you are kind of remote controlling your body. You are the pilot. You're driving it in a very different way than you used to when you had proprioception. And so here comes the question. So O'Shaughnessy. So I kind of like O'Shaughnessy. I like the things he's right about too. Most things somehow.
Oh, most
and,
things.
And here's the question: would you lose so much if you would say that proprioception is basic? Period. That it's not just.
What do you mean by saying proprioception is basic?
Well, that's maybe it's basic in a sense that you could take away any other sense, but you can't take away proprioception and build the. So basically, it doesn't.
Definitely, yeah. Sorry.
Okay, but then you are actually making a modal claim, right? It's just that the multimodality that comes later on is such that it can take the place of proprioception, post proprioception having done its work, right? But you still are sort of O'Shaughnessy camp.
I'm definitely in the O'Shaughnessy. I'm trying to do a version of the O'Shaughnessy project, as it were. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, good. So,
Any questions?
Emre.
Hi. So, okay, I'm a roboticist and I take things a bit more practical. But about this emphasis on proprioception, so it feels like I'm building systems, right? And so I'm interested in the affordances and Gibsonian way as well. But I feel, and what I do is I try to make the systems pure. So what I feel when I listen to your talk is proprioception is very important, yes. Depending on the action, if the action includes some interaction with the environment, then what we use and excel is the relation between proprioception and the touch feeling. But if we are like flying an airplane, then it is like we don't use it at all. We use some optic flow, like.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it. I mean, it's something very central, and then that is one of the things. Like now we can fly airplanes using robots, but we cannot grasp objects very well, or we cannot really walk very well because the relation between proprioception and the touch is very difficult to model and learn. That is one comment in general. So I feel that is very important, but I'm not sure that is the core. That is important for one set of type of actions, but not all the actions. And a question is related to embodiment and this tool use and body schema. So you have like emphasis on all three of these. My question would be like, when these tools are assimilated for our, but so you said it is very fast process. How about the like the structure, kinematic or dynamic structure of these tools? So what do you think? Do they need to be anthropomorphically similar to our body to be assimilated to our body schema, or can they be completely different and they would still be represented in this parietal context? That is the question.
Yeah, great questions. So the first one, that's exactly the reason why I completely agree. That's exactly the reason why I restrict it to human agents and adult human agents. So I'm trying to give an account of what's central in those instances. Therefore, proprioception will be important. Now, if you want to give, so you could broaden the project in different ways. You could broaden the project so that you could ask what are conditions on action more generally. Then you have mental and physical action. Or you can have conditions on any possible action by any possible agent, in which it becomes very, very broad. So virtual agents, gods, spirits, and so on and so forth. So that's why I restricted my project, and that is why proprioception is coming out as important. So I completely agree. Second question, it's very interesting. In terms of tool use, so I think so the most interesting stuff about tool use comes from Giannaro's successor's lab. He's Alessandro Fane in Lyon, and what they have is so they've shown that when you, so most of the discussions of tool use are about the perceptual impact of tool use. So for example, people are probably familiar with the Iriki studies. Do people know the Iriki studies? Should I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. This is very cool, although the stats in the original paper are very, very bad. Okay? So if you look at the original stats, it's really cool. But so they recorded from bimodal neurons in the macaque, and if you look at this kind of the different types of neurons that they recorded from, and you get expansion of the receptive field after using the tool and not just holding the tool, okay? And you have it both with sort of, you have different receptive field areas for different parts here. So this is a receptive field that's covering the hand, it's expanding to the tool, and here you have receptive field for the neuron associated with, the shoulder, which is for reaching, expansion of reaching, okay? An even more cool result is done by Japanese researchers, published in Neuroscience, Nature Neuroscience, 2 sets of papers, and this has to do with what's called temporal order judgments. Okay, so 2 hands, one hand is touch first and then the other. Okay, if you do this very fast, it's going to be very, very hard to tell. Okay. So when they do this kind of experiment, they do like thousands of trials, you get touched on one hand and the other, and so on and so forth. Speed it up and so on and so forth. Then you get this kind of classical S-curve, psychophysics. So what happens when you do that is, for sighted people and late blind people, if you cross your hands, so you have to do this task with your eyes closed, it goes really bad. Curve flattens massively. Okay? So this is classic result. Frederick de Vimont has used this to argue for multimodality in bodily awareness. Now, so Japanese take these drumsticks, their tools, and then they do the same experiment. Okay, so initially you get the same results with the drumsticks. Cross the drumsticks like that, you get the flattening. Cross the drumsticks in different way, you get the flattening too. What happens if you do a double cross? It goes back to normal. Very cool result. No, but this also indicates something, because the middle bit isn't anything like the structure of a normal body. So there's something about spatial extension and projection here, which is not like a kind of resisting, supporting surface. Okay? And on that front, the lab of...
Did they try this?
With the hand?
Because unless they try this, the result is not.
What?
because my hand can do the same thing. So if you don't get with the hand but get with the tool, then you get a different result. But unless you
I think you
try
can't have the hand because it's too sensitive, so you feel the vibrations from the other side.
because it can be very touched. So
Or you can run the experiment.
I will ask someone.
Yeah. So Nick Holmes and Charles Spence, that Matt in his project worked with a lot, they've run lots of experiments that indicate that a lot of the Iriki style experiments have to be interpreted in a somewhat circumspect way, because one prediction of the body extension account is that when you have a body extension, you should have a continuous expansion of the special properties. But they didn't find that for most of the cases. So you have the special hand-like properties at this point and at the end point of the tool, but nothing in between. So it looks like a modulation of space rather than of the limb. Now, so those are the perceptual kinds of results. Now this is action result. This is very cool because this is the first case of an action result, other than something which was reported by Bernstein anecdotally 50 years ago. So they get a grabber and they kind of do some lifting. And after the grabber, compared with the control, you get a difference in the transport component. So what this indicates is that the arm that the brain is represented as being longer after 2 years. And this is in the dynamics and the kinematics, and not simply in the perceptual stuff. Now, given this, then we have to return to your question about morphology and stuff like that. I think it's really an open question. What kind of morphology is possible? I think it really depends on limits of representation, representational interfaces, what's doable, what you can learn, and so on and so forth. So I think it's an open empirical question.
Sorry, can I just ask for clarification? These examples and what you've just said seem, from how I'm understanding them, is that we do extend our body's schema or something.
In this case, the action case, yeah.
Into tools.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought you drew a sharp line with her about tools as having that possibility.
No, I'm okay with them as body extensions in the sense of body schematic extensions.
Okay, can you just clarify, what was the thing you said? I will draw a line here.
Oh, that
body is not a tool.
Yeah, the body is not
but
a tool.
Tools can extend the body image. Body schema.
But you don't feel them from the inside.
You can feel them from the inside in the Istanbul sense, not in my sense.
Because I had a question. Okay.
Hey, delighted by this and fascinated by some of the experiments and doing a couple of things. Two words that keep coming through that cause a lot of trouble and confusion: awareness, consciousness, and the third one that goes with the representational states or structures. And I want to go back to the blindside cases that you had initially, because a whole lot of the relevant kind of awareness is not apperceptive, right? And so one of the things I thought was lacking in all of this was the Leibnizian Kantian distinction between consciousness or perception and self-consciousness or apperception. Because a whole lot of this bodily skill, as it's being acquired, right, by the trainee, will be much more overtly conscious and clumsy. And it's with the acquired skills that we no longer are attending to how we're trying to move our body, we're attending to what we're accomplishing through our skilled use and activity. And so the blindside cases are such clear-cut ones because we have patients who literally can't report on things plainly within their visual field, but when asked, as you know, they can indeed grab them and hand them over to the investigating MD. And so there's no trouble with their spatiomotor coordination, but they have no apperception. And so the awareness that goes into this kind of proprioception is most often not apperceptive.
That's right.
It's certainly informationally rich.
Right.
How that information is being processed, I don't know. And saying representational structures is just a pet label for a big X. So I wanted to come back to that just about this distinction between apperception and perception. Also putting proprioception is typically not apperception. Is that sympathetic to what you're trying to do? Or is that going to be a problem?
You can take it on board, please.
I think I can take everything on board unless you try to push some more elements of self-consciousness into the project.
But it might give it, if I get this right, it might get a difference. So when we're trying to put the vision, so if I don't have proprioception, right, I'm using vision. So one way of seeing the difference is that in vision I have to go through a kind of representation which is apperceptive to try to actually compensate for something which works in actually without a perception. So you might think that that's, for example, one big difference. So basically when you're saying that perceptive awareness, you're saying you're glossing over the awareness that gets from, let's say, 5 senses. They're generally also apperceptive, whereas the 6th one is not. So he's just saying differentiating them might give you also a tool to see why replacing one with another kind can actually create.
Okay, that's good.
So something like that. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, let me ask. Can you apply what Ilan just sketched to a cat?
Well, actually, part of what I wanted to go back to was your really cool results from the Japanese team. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the second name.
Kitazawa.
It was only half visible at the bottom of the screen here. But with the last combination where you've got, as you said, the double cross, the double crossing has restored the bilateral symmetry of the arms, even though the hands are crossed. So it's not such a surprise that it would return to pretty much normal.
Does this bear on the
No, this is fine. It's just that having restored the bilateral symmetry with the double cross means that the patient or the research subject can just attend to what is being done at and with the ends of the drumsticks and not have to compensate for these unusual crosses that are playing games with what is typically a bilateral asymmetry between left and right.
Well, there are a couple ways you can interpret this result. We can say that it's accidental that this is the case. And I mean, some of the physics depends on the transmission of vibrations through bodies. I mean, and what happens when we cross and the kinds of interference and the noise that results. But the way this is normally represented is that the way this result is normally explained is that developmentally sighted people very quickly get a visual dominance of external space over internal somatotopic space and somatosensory space, and that's what you see here basically.
My concern there is I want to know what happens when they start examining really skilled athletes and musicians.
They perform better. Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, in that they are...
The strong visual dominance might be an accident of the research group they're working on.
No, so they've done this kind of result across multiple cultures. It's very, very, very heavily...
Yeah, no, but I want the control group of non-athletes, the athletes, the touch typists, the violinists. I want those comparisons.
Yeah. Nobody has done those comparisons.
Yeah, I know.
But for example, I'm a violinist, and I don't get any of the illusions that I ever study. So I have no tactile illusions and proprioceptive illusions. And that's very sad. Can I come back to the apperceptive
Yes.
point very briefly? So if you can make the distinction in a cat, then I'm okay with it. If you can't make the distinction in a cat, then I'm not okay with it. So at the level at which I want to pitch the project, you should be able to run the claims with the cat. And then I think that when you have something that goes beyond what you can do in a cat, then you're going to get something extra coming from the first
this
person.
matters to your fight with Shaughnessy,
Okay.
right? Because the Shaughnessy is going to be thinking consciousness, apperception. I'm sorry, this has just been ground into Cartesian Anglophone philosophical thought. I think it's a mistake, but I think it would help you to be ready to spot that as a spurious source of objections to what you're trying to do.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yeah, but I think O'Shaughnessy actually thinks it's a priori inconceivable that you could act, any agent could act without a body that they feel from the inside in this other richer sense.
Did I say Cartesian?
Yes.
Yes, but the thing is, proprioception doesn't require a perception, so a cat can have proprioception, no problem.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I have a quick question, and I want to push the Istanbul line.
Yes.
So I'm glad you've sort of backed down a bit, but I'm wondering if you've backed down too much.
Uh-huh.
So I have a problem with feel from the inside, and I think there's a problem both with feel and from the inside, and both of them are sort of metaphors. So on the inside, you know, inside the ship. Yeah, so,
Right.
Yep. I think with feel, one problem with feel is, do you mean there's an association with feeling of some sort of conscious awareness, but now you said you don't want that, you just want it to be proprioceptive, coming from the proprioceptive system.
No. So when we're talking about feeling from the inside, we're talking about proprioceptive awareness. And then I weaken the claim to one about the capacity for proprioception, which includes both awareness and
the information.
Unconscious.
So one thing I'm wondering is about, when you started off at the beginning, you talked about these various senses, and you talked about touch. So also when we talk about feeling, touch is, we feel the, you know. And I was interested, I was thinking about vibrations. So of course, like, we're picking up on vibrations with touch, and that's a way of, you know, if my body's being shaken, I'm sort of feeling that from the inside, and in this sense, touch is being used proprioceptively. But I take it that when, well, I'm learning something. This is not.
No, I would disagree.
Okay.
Touch is being
Okay. So when I'm vibrating and I'm aware of my body vibrating, is that feeling from the inside or not?
Well, one thing about touch is that, so there's a question what kind of account we give of touch.
Yeah.
So if you give something like the template model of touch, which is O'Shaughnessy's account, the idea is that there's a duality to touch, so that there's the external kind of distal perception, but every time you have the external perception, there's some kind of bodily sensation that's involved too.
What do you think, though? Do you think, so, because I'm thinking that if you allow touch to be involved, to allow feeling from the inside, then of course you can feel the ship from inside, or you're in the aeroplane and you've got turbulence. And
That was my point with the wheel, actually.
You're feeling, when you're holding the steering wheel, you're actually feeling the vibration of the car. And there I think that either you say we don't feel our body vibrating from the inside, or you say we feel the car vibrating from the inside. So it looks like if you take the view you take, then it's going to push out things outside our body into the inside, because we're going to feel the vibration of the car from the inside.
I mean, nothing I want to say hangs on that. I mean, it's really about a question about individuation of the senses, and the standard psychology treatment treats vibration as tactile receptor, and then there's a question about how you want to deal with certain cases where the phenomenology is more intertwined, such that your entire body seems to be shaking, and then it's because it seems from the inside in a spatial sense. So does that make it then? From the inside? I mean, a couple of things. So one is from the inside in the spatial sense. can't necessarily be cutting it because you have the fishbone
Exactly.
kind of pieces, so
Exactly.
you have
Yeah.
touch from the inside too.
Yep.
Now, the bloated stomach it involves tactile components of stretch and so on and so forth, but that will be treated based on the list of senses before, interoceptively, also with some skin stretch. So it will be tactile plus interoceptive. And then this is the kind of case that both of us can experience, which is you have a titanium plate somewhere screwed on your leg. That's Lucas and I have had this. And Lucas, having some extra research funding, then kind of invents a titanium vibrator which resonates my tibia titanium plate. And just wanting to illustrate this very point. Then he asked me whether I feel it from the inside or in a sense it's clearly from the inside. It's inside my skin. But the mechanoreceptors which are coding for that are on the skin, the tactile ones. Then it's a question about how you want to individuate the senses. I think my project doesn't hang on
You could
that.
go either way there.
Yeah.
So nothing's stopping you to say that your body includes, say, the wheel and the car in some senses, that you extend...
For my project, I don't need to say that, but nothing stops me from saying that.
Why wouldn't you want to say it? That's the...
I want to get the core case right first.
Yeah, that's...
So I want to get the core case right and then be very liberal about the rest. I don't take the strategy of being hyper liberal and get everything in, because I think that misses some of the core distinctions.
So let's have a very quick break, and then let's get started in 5 minutes. We're running a bit ahead of time. I think the next session will